Okay, so in the last chapter we looked at experimental designs, and these included random assignment, using a control group, and being able to directly manipulate the independent variable. Now, experimental designs are the gold standard of doing quantitative research. Whenever it's possible to use a strong experimental design, that's exactly what you should do. However, what we want to study can't always be studied by experimental means, either for practical or ethical reasons. Does that mean we just give up and declare that our research subject is unresearchable? Of course not. Knowing something is always preferable to knowing nothing. I mean, at least in terms of research, there are some personal details that I'd prefer not to know about people. Just gonna check the old Facebook here. Oh, let's see what Grandma's doing. What? Grandma, no! Anyway, you can think of quasi-experimental designs as a common workaround for times when a strong experimental design is just not possible. Now, these designs are weaker in the conclusions because they're more vulnerable to potentially confounding variables. But they're better than nothing. Now, each of these designs is suited for a particular circumstance. They're not just interchangeable designs. And the decision of which one to use, it depends on the needs of the study. So let's go through them and talk about each of them in a little more detail. First up, we have the non-equivalent group design. Now, the textbook provided you with one way of thinking about non-equivalent groups, which is when you use matching to control a variable, such as the reading level. In this case, because the researcher has not used random assignment to create the groups, it's quasi-experimental. Now, I want to give you another way to think about using non-equivalent groups as well. The key to the non-equivalent group approach is at the outset, the groups are not the same. So for example, instead of one homogeneous group of 8th grade students, you might have a class of all boys and a class of all girls, such as you might find in like a phys ed class. Now, obviously, it's not possible to randomly assign gender. I mean, that's pretty much decided before your participants ever show up for your study. So in this case, if you're comparing boys to girls, these are going to be non-equivalent groups. And what you want to do is get a baseline pretest, then administer your treatment to both groups, and then get a post-test score from both groups. Now, the important thing to remember here is that we're not looking just at the differences in post-test scores, but we're looking at the relative change from the baseline to the post-test for each group. And that's what we're comparing. So for example, if we're looking at a training method to increase running speed for track and field, then we'd get a baseline pretest measurement for each group, for the boys and the girls. And we'd expect, given what we know, that boys are naturally going to be faster than girls on average. Now, there may be some girls who are faster than some of the boys, but on average, boys tend to be faster than girls. Then the next thing that we're going to do is administer our treatment. That's going to be the training. And then we test them again. And we may still see that boys are still faster than girls since they started out with, a head start. However, what you might find is that relative to each group's baseline, the girls actually increased their score more than the boys. Therefore, you might conclude that the treatment was more effective for girls than boys, even though boys are still faster. Now, with the interrupted time series, the key is to have several pre-tests and several post-tests. What you're looking for is kind of a level of stability in the pre- and post-test levels. For example, if I was looking at the effect of mindfulness training on the stress levels of intro to research students, I'd want to establish a stable baseline of stress.
Oh my God, writing is so hard. What is your fucking problem, man? Huh?
And I wouldn't be able to do this in a single measurement because we know that stress levels are going to naturally fluctuate up and down. You know, some days are just going to be naturally more stressful than others. However, over the course of, let's say, like 5 pre-treatment measurements, I'd be able to find a relatively stable average level of stress in students. Then once this baseline has been established, then I can start doing the mindfulness training. You know, we'll do some meditation, maybe some yoga and progressive relaxation, and we'll listen to, you know, all kinds of music and stuff. And as I'm doing these treatments, you know, I'm going to continue measuring. I want to see what's happening. And I probably am going to notice that the stress level on average of all the students in the class is going to probably go down. It may not actually reach like 0 stress, but it'll probably, you know, decrease somewhat. And then at a certain point, the stress level should level off a bit. And again, I'd want to make sure this is a consistent level, so I want to have several measurements to make sure that it's not just due to some sort of natural fluctuation or some other coincidental variable, like, let's say, spring break is coming up.
Spring break.
So with the interrupted time series, you want to see a level of stability before the independent variable has been introduced. And then you want to see a marked change in the dependent variable once you introduce the independent variable. And then there should be another level of stability after you've given the treatment to the group. And keep in mind, this is all within a single group or a single participant. Now for me, and probably for a lot of you, regression discontinuity was probably one of the most confusing of the quasi-experimental designs. So let me try and give you an example to kind of explain things. Let's say we're looking at the effect of scholarships on performance in graduate school. Now this could get very expensive for researchers if they were to recruit a random sample of an adequate size, like hundreds or thousands of students, and then randomly assign them either to receive scholarships or not receive scholarships. Therefore, as researchers, we're probably going to want to rely on the university to provide, you know, financial rewards, as they do. However, we also know that students who are high performers are the ones that are going to receive the scholarships. So let's say in our example is the top 10%. Now, of course, those top 10% are performing at a higher level already than the lower 90%. But GPA tends to be kind of linear, right? So there's not going to be a huge difference between people at the 90th percent and the 89th percent in GPA. So we make our cutoff point 90%. And in our baseline measurement, like I said, we should see sort of a linear trend. Then we're going to follow up with the students, all of the students in our sample, after about a year and see where their GPA ended up. Now our null hypothesis, you know, if the variables are not related, is that we should still see that linear pattern, right, with not much difference between the 89th percent and the 90th percent. And this would be true even if systematically all of the scores had decreased, as they tend to do when you get to university. Because it's kind of harder and more challenging than high school. So if your high school GPA was like a 3.8, it might go down to a 3.6. If it was a 3.0, it might go down to a 2.8, and so on and so forth. And if we plot all of these corresponding data points onto a graph, we should be able to draw a line through them called the line of regression. And remember, that's going to be probably a straight line if the null hypothesis is true. However, our alternative hypothesis is that the scholarships are going to have some kind of effect on grades and performance in college. So if this is true, then there should be a discontinuity in that line around the 90th percentile, right? Maybe everybody else drops, you know, 0.2 in their GPA, and those who got the scholarship actually stay, you know, in line with what they had before in high school. Therefore, we could probably attribute this gap between where the scores actually are and where they should be given a null hypothesis to the scholarships. But it's important to note that our conclusions are limited only to the group that received the treatment, and we can't really conclude anything about those who did not receive the treatment. In other words, all we can say is that scholarships seem to increase the performance of high-performing students. Now, it may also be that low-performing students could also have benefited from receiving scholarships, or that they had decreased because they did not receive a scholarship. But that's not what we studied. We're not necessarily comparing these groups. What we're comparing, again, is the high-performing students' scores after treatment with where they should have been given a true null hypothesis. So then we get to ABA and ABAB and ABABAB. I mean, you can go on forever if you like that. You can just think of it really as flipping a light switch on and off, you know. When the switch is down, the lights are off, and then you flip it up and the lights come on. But maybe that's due to some kind of coincidence. So you flip it off again and the lights go out, right? Then you flip it on and the lights come on, right? And you can go back and forth flipping lights on and off all day long if you want.
This is one of our many light switches. It functions in both the on and off mode. On, off, on, off.
Homer, he knows how to work a light switch.
So if you see a consistent pattern when the lights are only on when the switch is up, then you can probably conclude that there's a relationship between the light switch and the lights. So really the only difference between the ABA and the ABAB design is whether you want to end up, you know, with the lights on or in the dark.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again.
So next, another one that seems to confuse a lot of people is the multiple baseline design. I'll try and give you a sort of an example again to explain it. Let's say that you have a class, and in the class there are 20 disruptive students.
No. Monsters! What are you doing with this?
Aren't you gonna break it up?
No, 2 more days of this, and you'll quit.
And you're trying to figure out how to discipline these, you know, students, and you've tried everything. And so you want to see whether fitting them with an electric shock collar is going to reduce their disruptive behavior. Now these shock collars are going to be very expensive, and your school has kind of a limited budget, so you want to be very sure that it's the shock collar rather than some other variable making the changes, because if it works, then your school's going to invest in these for all of their classes, for all of their disruptive students. So how can we test whether or not the shock collar actually works? Well, we're going to use a multiple baseline design, right? I bet you guessed that. And we're going to start by looking just at the behaviors in a single student. Let's call him Billy. Billy the kid.
Are these all your lunches? You mean you eat other people's lunches? Stop it!
And so Billy's this bad kid, you know? He tends to talk back to his teachers. He's getting into fights with other kids. You know, he's swearing constantly, and he's drawing, like, really obscene graffiti on the desk. So he's a prime candidate for our research. So to begin with, we want to get a baseline reading for all of Billy's bad behaviors. How often does he talk back? How often is he swearing? How often is he getting into fights, and, you know, so on. Then we're going to target just one of those behaviors with the shock collar. So let's say it's going to be talking back to the teacher. Anytime Billy starts to talk back, the teacher's going to press a button on a remote control and it's going to zap him. And we're going to keep zapping him until he stops talking back to us. Now, as researchers, what we want to see is that the talking back behavior is going to decrease while the other behaviors are going to probably stay relatively the same. And then once we've seen that, then we'll move on to the next behavior, let's say the fighting. Now we're still going to be zapping Billy when he talks back, but he's probably not going to be talking back as often as he has been, you know. But now we're introducing the second variable, which is the fighting, and we're going to zap him every time he starts fighting as well. And again, we only want to see a change in this variable, the fighting, while the others stay relatively constant. And so one by one, we're going to address each of these behaviors with the shock collar to see the changes. And if we only see changes when we've introduced the sort of shock treatment to Billy, then we can kind of start to conclude that it's the shock treatment and not some other variable that's causing the changes. So then we come to like parent-teacher night, and we meet with Billy's mom, you know, and we're telling Billy's mom, you know, what a remarkable turnaround this kid has had in our class, and he's, you know, one of the best behaved students there, you know, and she seems really surprised because anywhere outside of school, you know, he's still a little monster. So then, being the researchers that we are, we explain our process, you know, of using the shock collar and the shock treatment, and we offer to let her use it as well outside of school. Just because as researchers we want to make sure that it's not something specific to the school, that this treatment can be applied in other locations or other environments. And so Billy's mom starts to shock Billy at home, just at home, right? To see if the changes are happening. And eventually, you know, following our process, Billy settles down at home and he's a, you know, well-behaved child at home. You know, and then next she's going to start shocking him in church when he starts acting up, right? Or when she takes him out to go shopping. And so one by one in these different environments or these different locations, she applies our process of shocking Billy, and the behaviors start to decrease in these different locations. And so, you know, as researchers, again, we only want to see changes in the different location when the shock treatment has been applied. And if we see that, then we can kind of rule out environmental variables as being a confounding factor in the relationship between the shock treatment and the decrease in Billy's bad behaviors. Meanwhile, you know, since we've had so much success with Billy, you know, he's kind of well behaved everywhere. I mean, he's kind of developed a drooling and mumbling habit, and, you know, he smells a bit like burnt hot dogs, but otherwise he's a good kid now.
How about it, you creeps, you lunatics, mental defectives? Let's hear it for Bull Goose Randall back in action. Nice shirt, Chesaroo.
Well, we're going to decide to apply our shock treatment to the other children. And we're going to, again, do it one by one. And so, in addition to Billy, now we're going to start shocking Mary through the same process, and hopefully we're going to see that once we apply the shock treatment, her negative behaviors are going to go down. But only hers and Billy's and not the other students. But here's the problem. The kids in the class aren't stupid, right? After a few of them get zombified by this shock treatment, you know, the others are going to start taking notice. And what we're probably going to see is that negative behaviors across the entire classroom are going to start to go down, you know, without applying the shock treatment to each of the students. This is because of something called social learning. We learn through the examples of others. Unfortunately, that kind of limits the power of our study. It's difficult to tell whether it's the shock treatment that's effective or just, you know, scaring the hell out of the kids. There's an interrelatedness between what you do to one kid in the class and what happens with the other ones. So one way that you might want to avoid this as a researcher is to use sort of a cluster sampling strategy. You target maybe a few of the worst kids in a class, and then maybe a few of the worst kids in another class, in another school somewhere, and so on and so forth. So you would find, you know, several different locations to do this, and your participants would be kind of separated out and isolated. And in this way, that social learning's not going to have as much of an effect as it would in a single class. So that's multiple baseline across behaviors, across environments, and across individuals. So finally, we've got the changing criterion design. And we already talked a little bit about the interrupted time series, so just think of this as multiple versions of that. You know, first of all, you want to get your stable baseline measurement over time. In this case, we could say maybe there's a person who is scared of spiders, right? They've got arachnophobia. And we'll administer sort of an anxiety scale, right? And they'll probably be something like a 10, you know, or 11 out of 10. Who knows? I mean, they're pretty frightened of these spiders. And then you teach them, you know, the relaxation skill. Breathe deeply, be calm, relax your muscles, be mindful, visualize a pleasant place. And so that's just going to be kind of the treatment, this mindfulness relaxation treatment. Now, the first criterion that you might want to sort of address, right, is to have the person just think about a spider. Like a big, hairy, googly-eyed one that's got, like, you know, sharp fangs and scary looking. And of course, the person's going to get all anxious and stressed out thinking about this spider, right? But then you get them to breathe deeply and calm down, relax their muscles. And through treatment, you want to find that there's sort of a change in the response to the visualization of the spider. You know, maybe we're at a 10, you know, and we're going to go down to like a 2. And to be able to do that consistently over and over again. And so once that criteria has been met, then you move to the next one. And maybe that's going to be being in the same room as a spider that's in a terrarium on the other side of the room. And again, we use the relaxation treatment to breathe deeply. And relax, let your muscles relax. And again, we should see that this relaxation treatment helps to reduce the anxiety. And so then we can incrementally start moving the participant closer and closer to the terrarium and keep working on their anxiety at each stage. And then when the participant can stand next to the terrarium, you know, without totally freaking out, then maybe the next step is to have them hold the spider in their hand. Or maybe get covered with spiders. I mean, I don't know. It depends on how far you want to go with this. In counseling, this is called systematic desensitization. And it's commonly used to treat phobias. But as a researcher, you can see there are multiple stages in which treatment has been applied, which would be the independent variable, and that the dependent variable, the anxiety levels, have been reduced. So there's an effect. You see this kind of relationship between the IV and DV, and you see it repeated multiple times. And then each time the criteria is met, and sort of you reach a plateau or sort of a stable level, you introduce a new criteria and keep going with the treatment. So those are pretty much the most common quasi-experimental designs that are sort of out there. And like I said, these are workarounds for, you know, any time that you're not able to use like an experimental design. They provide some evidence for cause and effect relationships, but they're not as strong as experimental research designs.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web in his eyes, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes